We discuss now governance in a little more detail. The content of the governance section is the following. We are discussing why governance is important in business and also look at some of the problems associated with activity and entity system governance. We provide the theoretical background of governance and then key concepts and systemic guiding principles of governance in general and activity system governance specifically. We look at redesigning and managing activity system governance. Then we present key concepts and systemic guiding principles of entity system governance and the redesign and managing of entity system governance. Why is it important to business? Well, simply, governance is responsible ultimately for the development of the organization. If the environment changes, it is up to the organizational governance to respond to those changes flexibly and appropriately and rapidly. So the faster the change, the more flexible and the more rapidly changing the organization itself must be. Systemic governance that we are discussing in this module wires the organization for ongoing change. What that means is it embodies governance into the different functions of the organization. It embeds maximum self-governance into the different parts of the organization in a coordinated manner. An organization that is not wired for change or that has inappropriate governance is likely to be retarded and can even be destroyed in the context of a rapidly changing environment. Some of the inappropriate governance would be a bureaucratic organization, outdated aims, outdated procedures, too many procedures, inflexible procedures, or hidden aims, or conflicting aims, or different aims at different levels in the organization. So all the problems that we have discussed in the context of the different forces of organization are ultimately the responsibility of governance to sort out. And this is really what organization transformation is about, to look at all those problems, surface them, and find appropriate solutions for them, and then maintain an appropriate functioning. Governance-related problems associated with an activity system include the wrong type of regulation, namely using form-maintaining, form-creating, or form-destroying regulation in the wrong context, and also insufficient or inappropriate self-governance or external governance. This could be either too much self-governance that is not limited by external governance, or too much external governance which doesn't allow sufficient self-governance, in any combination. Another set of problems refers to no or poor performance management. This can be due to lack of controls or performance criteria that are inappropriate, or that monitoring or evaluation mechanisms are absent or not enforced or not sufficient. Some of the governance-related problems of entity systems are the following: that there are governance frameworks that are uncoordinated, or that there are no overarching governance frameworks in an organization. That means that the governance frameworks reside in parts of the organization being suboptimal in terms of the larger whole. Another problem is if coordinating governance is not enforced. There may be laws or rules or regulations around it, but if they're not enforced, then there will be suboptimization. Insufficient performance management could also be a governance problem. This could be due to lack of criteria and/or lack of performance management procedures. Or performance management could be uncoordinated and not standardized. That means different parts of the organization have different criteria and even different monitoring and evaluation mechanisms and procedures. No learning happening across the organization can also be due to lack of governance, especially that associated with knowledge management. It can result in repeated mistakes being made in different parts of the organization and at different intervals, or that the wheel gets reinvented regularly. We have heard that there are 7 forces of system organization, one of them being governance. Governance has an overarching role amongst those 7 because it influences all of them. The emphasis of governance in activity systems and entity systems differs. We can see from the figure that governance interfaces with the other forces. What this means practically is that the governance force is governing or managing each of the other forces. For example, it implies that we govern environmental relations, that we govern or manage our substance, that we govern how and who is deciding ethos for our system, who and how are aims determined, who and how creates the flow of process structure and sets the governance for the system. So we are dealing here with the governance of governance. Then we have said previously that the 7 forces of system organization determine both an activity system and an entity system, but that the emphasis of each of the forces differs with respect to these 2 types of systems. In the case of governance, we emphasize regulation or aims achievement in the context of the activity system, while we emphasize coordination between the activity systems in the entity system governance. Activity system governance consists of aim setting, that is what the system wants to achieve, and regulation, how the system is going to achieve what it wants. And that this involves feed-forward and feedback mechanisms like feeding aims and planning forward to the system, monitoring how the system performs, and evaluating the performance would be feedback mechanisms. We have also learned about tapping, that if we are feeding forward an aim, for example, or a plan to a system, it needs to tap that, incorporate that in order for governance to continue. We have also discussed different types of regulation, namely form creating, form destroying, and form maintaining, and that we need to use the right type of regulation in the right context if we really want to achieve our aims. We need this knowledge again in the context of entity system governance. The emphasis of governance in entity systems is coordination between activity systems. This will require the cascading of aims through all systems from the level of the entity system into each activity system and into each sub-activity system. For this, we will require coordinating governance structures. That is, more specifically, we will need to create planning forums along the 3 dimensions of the matrix. And we need coordinating frameworks and criteria, which are also cascaded into each of the activity systems and sub-activity systems. And these frameworks and criteria need to very carefully look at what type of regulation they embody, if it is form creating, form destroying, or form maintaining. And we must ensure that they embody the correct type of regulation. And when we deal with entity system governance, we will emphasize a governance hierarchy. Cascading means governance hierarchy. It means that if we have self-governance at, for example, the sub-activity level. There is external governance from the activity system and entity system level cascaded that limits self-governance. So the alternation between self-governance and external governance through the systems hierarchy is a very important principle of systemic governance. We have also previously discussed the difference of governance roles, namely management and leadership. And if we are looking at the difference between activity and entity system governance, to achieve the goals within an activity system requires management. To align the different interests of the different activity systems will require leadership. This section deals with the key concepts and systemic guiding principles of governance in general. The definition of governance. The word is derived from the Latin gubernare and means to steer. So steering a ship is a very good analogy of what governance is about. We have the ship that goes on its way, and by turning the rudder, in other words, giving different information, we shift the whole boat into a new direction. So this is really ultimately what governance is about, to direct the operations of the organization. The governance of a system consists, on the one hand, of aim setting. We have already discussed aims. Every system must have aims, overarching aims like purpose, mission, vision, ideals, objectives, strategies, etc. This is typically done in the course of planning. So planning is an important governance activity. And the other aspect of governance is regulation. Regulation makes those adjustments to the functioning that allow the system to achieve its intended aims. This requires regulatory criteria, like more specifications of how performance should be made and what the outcomes should be, regulatory frameworks, as well as regulatory processes like feed-forward and feedback activities. Feed-forward would be giving instructions of what should be done, while feedback includes monitoring the outcomes, evaluating the outcomes, and then, of course, making the necessary adjustments. So governance is actually a sub-activity system of an activity system. So every activity system, if it is regular and organized, has a sub-activity system that governs it. The graphic depiction of that sub-activity system is aligned with a governance arrow tip. This arrow tip is distinct from the other arrow tips of activity system that denotes our aim, or the time-space arrow tip that we put in the time-space graphs, or the impact arrow tips. Governance involves feed-forward as well as feedback activities. And because of the duality or two-directionality of activity, we give the governance arrow two arrow tips. Governance spans the whole activity system, from the inputs to the outputs. To denote that, we represent the governance arrow as a bracket rather than a single line. One of the first governance rules that we need to understand is that regulation tends to overrule aims. So if we are preaching a particular course, a particular aim, but our regulation pushes the system in a different direction, then we will not achieve the aim. For example, in an organization, if we want knowledge sharing, and because we want to build a learning organization, But in our reward systems, we are rewarding and evaluating personal knowledge, personal expertise, then people will not be willing to share knowledge because it is neither valued nor rewarded. So the rule of thumb is you get the behavior you reward and evaluate. Therefore, evaluate and reward the behavior you want. As a management consultant, we encounter that often if we go into an organization and they try to achieve something, and in spite of training, in spite of preaching, it is not being done. One of the reasons why that is not happening is a reward system that overrules the desire. So one is advised to look, is there a rule somewhere that prevents the system to achieve the set aim? We can look at different types of governance. The first type of governance is according to origin, and we can distinguish between self-governance and external governance. Self-governance has to do with empowerment. The system and the members of the system are empowered to make decisions themselves, while external governance is power over. Some external force would say this is or isn't allowed. The governance rules involved is that ideally one ensures maximum self-governance. The reason for that is that the system has most information available to be able to make decisions that are really appropriate to the situation, while external governing agents normally are not so familiar. That is why organizations, when they have different business units in different parts, geographic regions, for example, would give lots of self-governance to those business units. External and internal governance form a governance hierarchy. In other words, even if a system is empowered to do its own thing, it is always within a certain framework of external governance. For example, we can drive throughout the country wherever we want, as long as we stick to the externally determined traffic rules. Likewise, the business units in different countries can exert a lot of self-governance, but there will be rules and regulations for the organization as a whole that each business unit has to adhere to. So the wider the framework of self-governance is, the more self-governance is possible, the more decentralization is possible. Ultimately, external governance always limits self-governance because every system exists within a larger system which exerts governance. So every organization exists within a society, society exists on the planet, and all those systems exert their own governance, and if a system wants to survive, it needs to adhere to those limits. Another way of looking at governance is according to the effect the governance has. And we can distinguish three types of governance: form maintaining, form creating, and form destroying governance. In other words, we can have governance that maintains the system, the form of the system exactly as it is. The typical example that is always mentioned in system thinking is the air condition. The air condition maintains the temperature in the room. As soon as the temperature goes out of range, the governance kicks in and cools or heats the temperature so that the temperature stays within a narrow range. Most laws are form maintaining. They want to make sure that the society or the organization or the family are adhering to a set of rules and do not exceed those in their behavior. Form creating governance means that we want to change the form of the system. We want to develop the system, we want to be creative, we want to transform the system. For this we need form-creating governance. For example, in education, when our aim is to really develop every pupil or student as much as possible, we need form-creating governance. An example would be, the more questions a student asks, the more information will be given. Obviously, at some stage, a form-maintaining governance needs to kick in, because if the teacher is always answering the questions of that one very interested and bright student, the other students will be neglected. So while form-creating governance is very motivating, form-creating, it needs to be limited. Another example would be, the more one works, the more bonus one gets. There is some point when one says you cannot work more because you would burn out, for example. So form-maintaining governance of being tired or exhausted or burned out would kick in. Form-destroying governance is used when we want to get rid of behavior that is not desirable, discrimination, criminal behavior, for example, or behavior that the system cannot tolerate, and those are normally associated with sanctions. The governance rules, form-maintaining tends to limit form-creating governance. In other words, there's always some form-creating governance that sooner or later comes to the fore to limit form-creating. At the same time, in creativity, we have the opposite. Form-creating overrules form-maintaining governance. So if we want to change the system, we want to have new rules, new aims, then we need to overrule the form-maintaining governance that exists. Otherwise, we will not have a transformation of the system, but the system will carry on as it is now. However, once we have transformed the system, we have decided on new rules, on new aims, on new governance processes, we need to create form-maintaining governance to maintain that new system. And we need to have form-destroying governance to make sure that there is not some element destroying the new order we have created. If we fail to put form-maintaining and form-destroying governance into place, then there will be the tendency that the system carries on reinventing itself and probably going into an anarchic state, becoming an anarchy. In praxis, it is important to balance those three types of systems within an organization or within society. Failing to do that, if, for example, form-maintaining tends to overrule form-creating where we should have form-creating, we would have a bureaucracy. We would not be a very creative organization. While the creative organization that has no form-maintaining governance keeps running wild, so to speak. Governance always forms a hierarchy. If you're looking at nature, for example, the calcium household in the body has, I believe, 12 governance loops. It's a hierarchy of 12 different governance circuits, always one kicking in if the previous one doesn't work. So if 11 governance loops are not working, there's a 12th. In society or in organizations, we normally don't very well look at these governance loops. We are often putting rules in place, but then we don't police them. There's no governance that ensures that those rules are actually being met. And if we don't have those governance loops that ensure that rules are being met, why have the rules in the first place? So the hierarchy alternates between internal and external governance. There's always and internal governance. At the next level of the systems hierarchy is internal governance limited by external governance from the next level in the systems hierarchy, and so on. Some of that governance will be form creating, some form destroying, and some form maintaining. So at one level, the system is free to behave in an empowered manner, limited by external form maintaining governance and external form destroying governance. At that next level, there will also be form creating governance limited by form destroying and form maintaining external governance. But there can also be form creating external governance, for example, the encouragement through reward systems would be form creating external governance. Designing a well-balanced governance in an organization or a society, for example, is more an art than a science. We know the rules, but the fine balancing can involve a lot of learning. We try something and we realize it doesn't work, and there is even experimentation. If we come back to our example of steering the ship, very often if one steers an object and turns it away on a new course, there is some kind of overshoot before one corrects again to get more or less on the course. And the same is true for these various governance loops that interact with each other. They are very difficult sometimes to understand in a rational manner because some of them work also in a counterintuitive way, especially if there are time lags involved, that some governance only comes in at a later stage and the system behaves already earlier. So there's a lot of experimentation, but the governance rules are clear, and one can analyze every governance from the point of view of those principles that we have mentioned here. There's also transformative governance. Normally in business there's a lot of talk, or in society, about leadership, and one of the aspects of leadership is to transform the system. In fact, transformation of a social system without leadership is almost impossible, because it involves changing the existing ethos, the existing values, changing very often existing aims, putting an organization or a social system on a new course, and also changing the rules to reinforce the new aims and the new ethos. And most importantly, one needs to align stakeholders in support of that. So to align stakeholders who have their own interest and convince them that that new ethos, the new aims, the new rules will make sense requires leadership. So for that reason, any transformation is requiring leaders. It may be useful to have a quick look at management versus leadership, because both are governance styles or governance processes. Management typically involves achieving the aims that have been set, the predetermined aims, while leadership means leading outward into a new direction, aligning stakeholders, getting their agreement, and generating cooperation with systems in the outer and inner environment. In other words, leadership works across systems boundaries, and it also involves transforming their own and maybe also aligned systems, as we said, through new ethos, new aims, new rules that reinforce it. If we can use the analogy of the ship again, I would argue that leadership has to do with changing the course of the ship, while management has to do with regulating the ship in such a way that it actually stays on course and achieves the aim set by the course. There is active and passive governance. Up to now, we have discussed active governance. There is, however, also passive governance, which is inherent in the structure of the system. So the structure of the system is not directly exerting governance, it is indirectly exerting governance in the sense that it allows the matter energy information flow according to the way the structure is configured. We can use the analogy of the river to illustrate that. The riverbed governs indirectly the way the river flows. If it is narrow and steep, the river will flow faster than if it is broad and flat, for example. Likewise, a system channels the flow of its MEI. In the case of an activity system structure, the flow is channeled by the way its support and acting resources are configured. They are responsible for the way the processing matter energy information flows. This is illustrated by a production line. So the supply chain, for example, is governed passively by the way the supply chain structure is configured, as well as, of course, the active governance. In the case of an entity system, its structure channels the way the different activity systems interact with each other and interchange matter energy information. This is illustrated by the organogram, which represents the structure of the entity system. Now let us look more specifically at the governance of an activity system, one of those string-like systems in the biomatrix, or a functional system or business process as we call it in business. The governance of an activity system involves, first of all, setting strategic and operational aims. What is the outcome that the activity system ought to achieve? What is its aim? Typically, that aim is cascaded from overarching organizational and functional systems. So the organization has an overarching mission which determines every single aim to a greater or lesser extent within the organization. And then there are specific functional aims, almost generic aims associated, for example, with IT or with HR or finance. So wherever I am in the systems hierarchy of an organization, the aims need to be cascaded from the organizational as well as my specific functional system. Then we need to determine performance evaluation criteria. We need to set criteria that we know that the aim is being achieved according to certain quality measures, specs, norms, etc. We can distinguish ends criteria and means criteria. What we mean by that is ends criteria describe the outcome, the quality of my output, for example, while the means criteria determine or prescribe how the behavior of the system must be, how my production processes must be. For example, we need to adhere to safety standards, health standards, industry norms. Those guide how we do things. So means criteria are concerned with how we do things, while ends criteria describe what the quality and the outcome of the end, the output of the activity system should be. Again, the ends and means criteria are cascaded from overarching organizational or functional systems. Now, typically, the ends criteria come from the organization and also from functional specifications. Or if we talk a business process, it would be the customer who determines how the quality of the product should be that we're producing. And then a governance of an activity system involves also governance mechanisms. That means activity systems or process systems that help us achieve those outcomes in such a way that we meet aims and criteria. Typically, that involves feed-forward or planning. In other words, we are telling the system what we expect from the system and how it should behave, specifying the kind of outcome it should achieve, and then feedback mechanisms. We need to find out, monitor and evaluate, are we actually doing the right thing so that we are on the way to achieving those outcomes, and at the end when we have finished production, did we actually achieve the outcomes? So between the feed-forward and feedback mechanisms, we will adjust the behavior of the system to get the outcomes according to the standards we desire. Now let us look at governance from a graphic perspective. Here is our activity system, our string-like system or organized process system. For example, it could be a production system in the organization. So first we need the overarching aims that are given from another system, the organization or my functional system. This is external governance. Then we can start our own internal regulation, starting with feed-forward. So planning. What is the aim that we want to achieve in terms of the cascaded aims from the external system? And we also need to determine the outcomes, the criteria, the outcome criteria also cascaded from the external systems. And this we feed forward. And this is what drives our behavior in the activity system, our MEI flow and our structures within the activity system. Then we need to monitor, and this is where feedback kicks in, we need to monitor and evaluate, are we achieving the aims that we determined beforehand? Are we needing to change? If we are not achieving the aims using the behavior we ought to, we need to make adjustments to MEI flow, or if we do restructuring then of the production line, then we would need to change the production line as well. A cascade governance through all sub-activity systems. This involves cascading aims and criteria into each sub-activity system, adjusting them to make them relevant to that specific sub-activity systems, then regulate the performance of each sub-activity system through the same regulatory mechanism of feedback, feed-forward, and adjustments. The regulated activity systems link up with each other to form a supply chain. The principle of cascading governance is the same for the internal supply chains within an organization as well as for an industry supply chain. So if we illustrate again, we have our production process with sub-processes. If we go back to our baking, the ingredient assembly phase, the dough mixing phase, the baking phase, and so on. Each of those phases is governed. It has its own outcomes that it wants to achieve. It has its own regulation, its own specifications, norms, guidelines of how to go about it. And there's an overarching supply chain governance. And adjustments are made on the basis of feed forward, as well as feed the aims and feedback. So for example, if we have been baking chocolate cakes for a few hours and now the order comes in for a different kind of cake, a nut cake, then feed forward goes a new aim with new specifications which will affect every single phase, the ingredient assembly phase and the mixing phase and the baking phase. And we will have feedback processes that monitor, is the dough of the right consistency, are the ingredients fresh enough, is the temperature in the oven correct. So we are governing the whole supply chain. The governance principles that apply to sequential sub-activity systems apply in the same way to a parallel sub-activity system. It is the same model. If we have an external supply chain, we are using the same principles like if you're using an internal supply chain. Typically, we are not doing overarching supply chain management across industries sufficiently. That is why it comes to inconsistencies between different parts of industries. The regulation of an activity system gives rise to performance management or the performance management cycle. The feed-forward feedback and adjustment in performance management we call planning, which is feeding forward. Then we implement and we have outcomes which we evaluate against the intended outcomes, feedback. And then on the basis of that we adjust by either replanning, starting the circle all over again, or maintaining the performance of the system. If we also consider the cascading of aims together with the regulation of an activity system, we get the strategic performance management cycle. In other words, we are cascading aims from the organizational and functional strategic plans to the operational plans of our system, which we implement, evaluate, and then on the basis of the outcomes of the evaluation, replan or maintain the system. This section is concerned with redesigning and managing activity system governance. In summary, the design and management of an activity system governance involves the following. We need to establish performance criteria for the various aims and also appropriate reward systems that assure that the aims are achieved. We need to consider the types of governance, that is form creating, form maintaining, form destroying governance, and have an appropriate mix between the three in terms of criteria as well as reward systems. Otherwise, the system will not achieve its aims. We also need to consider relevant governance from the environment. There is generic industry governance, the market governance, then specific demands from clients, suppliers, and other stakeholders. And then, of course, there is the governance from the organization of which the activity system is part that needs to be considered. And there may also be various interacting functions that impact on the governance of the activity system. Then we need to design and manage regular strategic and operational planning and performance management. We need to establish the praxis of stakeholder planning in all non-routine decision-making situations. And we need to establish organizational learning, namely that all planning, strategic planning and also operational planning and performance management is learning-based, and that learning needs to be linked to knowledge repositories. This section is concerned with key concepts and systemic guiding principles of entity system governance. Let us now look at the key concepts of entity system governance. As we have explained before, there is active and passive governance of a system, and that the passive governance of a system is exerted by the structure of the system. In the case of an entity system, the structure of the entity system determines the interaction of its activity systems. In the case of an organization, we speak of the organizational structure that is depicted by an organogram. So the organogram shows us what kind of passive governance that particular organization has. Like all structures, the three-dimensional matrix also exerts passive governance in three-dimensional ways. The matrix structure channels the flow of meta-energy information in physical reality, that is the flow of goods and services and activities. It also channels along the same lines the flow of governance, namely of the information associated with conceptual reality through the planning forums and through the planning activities. And it encourages these flows in both functional and cross-functional ways. Let us look at more detail of the inherent governance associated with each of the three types of activity systems. The business activity system encourages a business focus and business-related governance. This is cross-functional governance and cross-functional coordination. It also gives rise to cross-functional efficiencies, development, learning and innovation, but with respect to the focus of that one business. The business support activity systems encourage a function-specific focus and function-specific governance. So they bring in the governance associated with the industry of that specific function. They bring in the knowledge associated with that specific function, and they give rise to function-specific efficiencies, development, learning, and innovation. And because they run across the business activity systems, they give rise to cross-business coordination and also economies of scale and cross-business development from the perspective of this particular function. The organization support activity systems interface with all other activity systems, and they give rise to both a function-specific as well as organization-specific focus and governance. So, for example, if we look at the corporate finance support activity system, it has a function-specific perspective. It governs all activity systems from a finance perspective, and it creates a coordination across all activity systems from a financial perspective. So thereby it gives rise to organization-specific efficiencies, economies of scale, development, learning, and innovation. This is one of the reasons why so many organizations nowadays have central services, because they coordinate throughout the organization and also give rise to organization-specific desirable emergence like efficiency, economies of scale, etc. The governance of an entity system requires coordinating governance that is valid for each part of the organization and that has the purpose of holding the parts of the organization together and also informing the functioning of the parts. This includes overarching aims, coordinating regulatory frameworks, coordinating governance structures like coordinating planning forums and planning and decision-making structures, then cascading of aims and regulatory criteria through cascading of planning and cascading of performance management, as well as organizational learning. If an organization has all those parts integrated into its day-to-day functioning, then we can say that the organization is wired for ongoing change, that it can adapt itself to changes in the environment in a creative and developmental way. We are looking now in more detail at each of those elements of governance. So what are the systemic principles of a learning organization that is wired for ongoing change? Well, first of all, it has overarching aims. In the aims section, we have discussed in more detail what kind of aims exist. So the overarching aims of an organization would be, first of all, the purpose of why the organization exists, an ideal statement, and maybe its representation in a vision with which every member of the organization can identify. Then the organization will require a threefold mission and some key objectives and key strategies associated with the threefold mission and in general. The threefold organizational aim of a mission is derived from the organizational structure of an entity system, namely that the entity system consists of outward, inward, and self-directed activity systems. So here we have the outward directed activity systems of the entity. That is the kind of products and services the organization wants to deliver to its external clients. So this is the first part of a mission statement. What do we want to do for our clients? Secondly, what do we want to do for our staff members? How do we want to support the stakeholders of the inner environment? And also, what do we want to do for ourselves as an organization, and how do we want to be as an organization? So those are the three types of aims that are overarching for the organization, from which the different lines can take their information. Then we need coordinated regulatory frameworks. There are different kinds of frameworks within an organization. For example, we have function and business process specific regulation. That could be industry regulation that is valid for every function. For example, employment, safety criteria, etc., where every part of the organization has to adhere to that, or health regulation or finance regulation. They are valid for every part of the organization that does anything concerning finance, budget control, etc. There can also be business-related regulation. For example, what market niche can our business units enter and which market niche not? Or what would be criteria for accepting a project or not accepting a project in the IT industry or engineering industry, for example? Or if we are in a business where we are having partners, what are the criteria for selecting strategic partners or not? Then there will be regulation concerning resources. What are the norms, specifications, quality criteria for the resources we use? For example, the kind of persons we want to employ, and also what are the criteria for the materials that we use in our production, for example. Then we will have performance-related regulation, that is individual and team performance-related, reward systems, evaluation systems, how do we do planning, how do we handle budgeting throughout the organization, what are safety, health criteria, how do we do knowledge management, etc. And then we will have regulatory frameworks concerned with governing the interaction of activity systems with each other. For example, regulation concerning service level agreements between the different functions of the organization, or how do we allocate resources between the different functional and business units in the organization. Another principle is concerned with planning forums. Planning forums need to be aligned to organizational structure, which in the context of biometrics, of course, is the three-dimensional matrix. So we need coordinating planning forums along the lines of the 3D matrix. both operational and strategic planning forums. Obviously, the operational planning forums are constituted of members who are working together on that particular line that is represented by the planning forum. The strategic planning forum will contain all members who are on the operational planning forum, but there could be additional organizational stakeholders who participate in the planning forum. For example, the HR, IT, legal, finance representation, if this is appropriate for the particular planning forum. Here we have our three-dimensional matrix. Governance flows along each line of the matrix, and each line also represents a planning forum. So, for example, along the business activity systems or the business units, we have a planning forum for each different business line. Those are cross-functional forums, and the purpose of those forums is the business or the product service delivery that occurs in that specific business unit. Then we also have cross-business unit planning forums that are function specific. For example, the marketing or the engineering planning forum. The representatives on that planning forums are all marketers, for example, that serve on each of the business units. And the purpose of planning in these forums is to advance the function, to create functional excellence, to create economies of scale, to share learning that occurred with respect to, for example, marketing in each of the business units, to use forum for problem solving around the specific function like marketing in whatever business unit the problem should be, and generally to share learning that occurred on each of the different business units. We also have planning forums along the organization support lines like IT, HR, the finance or legal departments. So they have their own planning forums, but they're also sending representatives to the planning forums of the different business units and all or some of the business support functions. So representation depends on the need of the different planning forums. Typically, that representation is not in operational planning forums, but only in strategic planning forums. Then the planning forums are coordinated at the top by an executive board. So members of the executive board are the heads of each of the business support and organization support functions. That is the whole management board. Probably there will be a more operations or short-term focused board that meets more frequently, that does not have all representatives there, but only representation of each of the three types of lines. Most individual members of the organization will be part of more than one planning forum. For example, the engineer who serves on one of the business units will be part of the planning forum of that particular business unit and will ensure that electrical engineering is coherently integrated in that particular business of that forum. But the engineer will also be part of the function-specific engineering forum, where the engineering representatives of the other business units are also present and where they can share, problem solve, etc. The governance of a matrix requires firstly that each activity system and sub-activity system of the matrix is governed, and that the coordination between all activity and sub-activity systems is governed. We have previously learned that the governance of an activity system involves aim setting, what the system wants to achieve, and regulation, how it is going to achieve what it wants to achieve. Likewise, every sub-activity system has an aim and has regulation. In the context of the entity system, the aim needs to be cascaded from the overarching aims of the entity system into that of the activity system and its sub-activity systems. At the same time, the aims at the level of the activity and sub-activity systems is also influenced by the specific requirements of the customers. Likewise, in the case of regulation of an activity system, it cascades its regulatory frameworks and criteria from the entity system level, and then it is cascaded further into the activity and sub-activity level. At the same time, regulation of specific activity and sub-activity systems in the organizational entity are also influenced by industry-specific and client-specific regulations and regulatory criteria. So besides having every single activity and sub-activity system within the matrix governed, we also need to govern their interaction, and this is illustrated by the fat orange lines which coordinate each bundle of activity system and bring the governance together at the level of the CEO and his or her board. So governance flows from the activity system upwards towards the entity as represented by the CEO and the board, and in return flows downwards into each of the activity and sub-activity systems. We have learned previously that at each point in the matrix, different type of activity systems interface, and likewise, each of those interfacing activity systems is governed. So the governance is interfacing in each point in the matrix, in each function, or in each employee. So each employee is actually having multiple accountabilities to different functional bosses, so to speak. And this is one of the challenges of matrix management, that one is governed by more than one authority and is accountable to more than one authority. So for example, in using the IT system, I'm accountable to the IT manager for the way I'm using the system. In terms of finance, I'm accountable to the corporate finance manager. In my activity along a particular business line, I'm accountable to the manager of that particular business. And in my functional capacity as the engineer or marketer, I'm accountable to the function head of marketing or engineering. Another principle of a systemic learning organization is that there's regular operational and strategic planning happening in each of the lines. Now, regularity is achieved on the one hand by a regular planning calendar. It is fixed up front at the beginning of the year, whatever, how often operational planning meetings take place. That could be daily or weekly or monthly, and could be different in different business lines depending on the need in each of those lines. And then there will be a planning calendar for strategic planning. Again, could be monthly if it's a rapidly changing industry, like maybe the IT industry, or quarterly or twice a year, or if it's a slower growing industry, maybe annual strategic meeting. Then each of the planning forums has a fixed planning agenda, so all operations meetings go through the same agenda point each time. Obviously at the end there can be what else, open agenda. Typically operational planning meetings are associated with the best business case, so achieving the best business case of the business that forum represents, while the strategic planning meeting agenda points most likely associated with the strategic planning procedure of the forum. Ideally, the same strategic planning procedure is followed in all parts of the organization, and as we hear later, those will also be linked to the knowledge repositories. An organization that changes its strategic planning procedure every year, or that allows different methods to be employed by different parts of the organization, typically different business units or functional units calling in different consultants who have their own preferred strategic planning agenda. So if an organization has these diverse planning procedures, there will be no regularity in strategic planning and very little coordination of the knowledge and information flow generated by strategic planning. So this is not ideal. Another way to achieve regularity is participation. So participation in planning forums need to be mandatory. If the different functions do not need to be represented in a planning forum, means that the ideal outcome of a planning forum cannot be achieved. It is almost purposeless to have planning meetings if half of the functions are not represented. Another important principle of a systemic learning organization that is wired for change is ongoing performance management. Performance management assists the organization in achieving its aims, and it also assists in creating continuous improvement in all parts of the organization. The performance management incorporates aims and regulation in an ongoing cycle of plan, implement, evaluate, replan, or maintain. That looks like that. So we have our action plan, which we implement, and then we evaluate the outcomes of implementation according to the performance criteria associated with our plan. And if necessary, if we didn't achieve the intended outcomes, we need to replan, or if we did achieve them, then we need to maintain the outcomes. So the ongoing plan, implement, evaluate, replan, or maintain cycle is what we refer to as performance management cycle. This cycle is followed in every planning meeting, both operational and strategic. So in other words, we always evaluate the outcomes since the last planning meetings, if they have or have not been achieved. Another principle of a systemic learning organization is that performance management is strategic. What that means is that the performance management cycle is informed by cascaded aims and cascaded performance criteria. In other words, the aims and criteria are cascaded through the hierarchy of the organization to the specific planning cycle of the moment. So our organizational strategic plan informs the functional strategic plan, which informs the operational function-specific plan, which gives rise to our action plan, the implement, evaluate. The evaluation criteria will also be cascaded through the strategic and functional and operational plans. At the level of the organization, we have the overarching strategic frameworks and overarching aims, both of which inform the functional planning. Functional planning can also be informed from external criteria. And these are cascaded into the action plan and its associated evaluation criteria. So this is what we refer to as strategic performance management. Another principle of a systemic learning organization is that we need to practice stakeholder planning. In other words, the strategic performance management cycle needs to consider stakeholders as appropriate. So we need to, on the one hand, communicate significant information to stakeholders, like if significant information occurred in this particular planning cycle, we need to communicate outcomes to stakeholders if necessary. So our performance management cycle has a communication link to stakeholders. This is part of stakeholder planning. Another part of stakeholder planning is that we consider stakeholders in planning. It is important to understand that consideration does not imply consultation. We are not saying that we have to have all stakeholders in every operational or even in every strategic meeting. But what we are saying is that if we are planning, we need to consider the interests of stakeholders. When would we need to consult them if we don't know what they want? And occasionally we would have a stakeholder participating in a planning meeting if that is relevant. We have our strategic performance cycle, and as we plan our organizational strategic plan, we need to consider stakeholders. We need to consider stakeholders in our functional planning, operational planning, as well as action planning and replanning. So this is the other aspect of stakeholder planning, the one being stakeholder communication, the other one being consideration in planning. Another principle of a systemic learning organization is that performance management ought to be conducted in a learning manner. That involves questions like, did we or didn't we achieve what we planned? And why did or didn't we achieve what we planned? And then deposit significant learning in knowledge repositories. So if we have our planning cycle, we would ask questions like, did we implement as we planned? If yes, did we achieve the outcomes? If yes, how do we maintain those outcomes? Or if we did not implement as per plan, why not? Do we need to replan, or do we need to change our plan? If we implement it as planned and we are not achieving the outcome, why not? Can we do something better, or do we need to replan? If we achieved our outcome, was it successful? Can we multiply the success? Can we build it into improvement? Can we communicate our success to somebody? So those are all the kind of questions we would be asking, and we would deposit important learning to our knowledge repositories. This is what we regard as organizational learning. Another aspect of knowledge management is that we deposit learning that occurred in management into our operational knowledge repositories, and we use that particular learning also in our operational planning or in our replanning. Sometimes in an operational planning meeting, an idea occurs that is of strategic significance. This will not be discussed in the operational planning meeting, but will be deposited in the strategic knowledge repository. So all this kind of learning is what we refer to as learning from doing. Beside learning from doing, organizational learning is also resulting from learning from planning. We have strategic knowledge repositories which we use, the input we use in strategic planning, both at the organizational and functional level. And we also deposit knowledge that we generated during our strategic planning meetings, we deposit that into our strategic knowledge repositories. So at any time in the organization, if we're looking at our strategic knowledge repositories, we have an understanding of what the strategic issues of the organization are at that moment. The way we are using strategic knowledge repositories can be that we are building on them. So if we have strategic planning meetings, we are not starting all over again, scanning the environment and doing impact analysis. We are using the environmental scans of the previous period that we have stored in the knowledge repositories, and we look at it, what is relevant, what is not relevant, edit this and add on. So we have more discussion based on what we know already than if each time in our strategic planning we are starting all over again, as is typical for many organizations. So this kind of learning is learning from planning. And this is another aspect of organizational learning. Organizational learning is not individual or team learning. Some organizations think if teams are interacting regularly, they have organizational learning. This is not so. Or sending individuals for ongoing training courses is also not contributing per se to the learning of the organization at organizational level. What would constitute a learning organization is if we were to replace every employee overnight with equally qualified other employees, and if the operations of the organization carry on as if nothing has happened, then we really have a situation where organizational knowledge is entrenched at the level of the organization. Obviously, this is an ideal that cannot be achieved, but we can try and approximate it. So organizational learning is an emergence from individual learning that is shared, team learning that is recorded, and learning that occurs from planning and from doing that is recorded. Knowledge repositories should also include a history of the organization, maybe some of the biggest successes and failure stories, important happenings in the organization, statements of founding fathers and mothers, etc. However, as useful as well-managed knowledge repositories can be, what they cannot transfer is tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is typically transferred in interaction. For example, a 5-star cook who publishes a recipe book will transfer a lot of knowledge, but what will not be transferred is the tacit knowledge that makes the excellent recipe into that 5-star dish. This is something that only experience and maybe also talent and excellence can give. And an organization that strives for excellence will have to have tacit management procedures. A lot of tacit management is transferred through mentorship programs, through apprentice programs, but also through ongoing planning, both in a cross-functional planning forum and in function-specific planning forums. There are also various knowledge management techniques that can be employed, and the correct facilitation of planning meetings can hugely contribute to the generation of tacit knowledge. So the right facilitation techniques are almost as important, or the way we use knowledge repositories and the way we learn and share knowledge is almost as important as the recording of the knowledge. All this together comprises organizational learning. This section is concerned with redesigning and managing entity system governance. The design of entity system governance involves coordinating frameworks and coordinating mechanisms. Examples of those are the performance management system. We need guidelines how we design performance criteria, how we evaluate performance, how we monitor it, etc. We also need the design of reward systems, because reward systems drive performance, and it needs to be very well thought through what kind of rewards we give for what kind of performance. In both the performance management system and the reward system, we need to look very carefully at a balance between the three types of governance: form creating, form maintaining, and form destroying governance, because the wrong mix of these three will give us the wrong outcomes. Then we need guidelines for resource distribution, how much resources will be allocated to which activity system. We also need service level agreements between different functions, how much service is given by one function to various other functions, and how to account for and reward for these services. Then we need guidelines for business development, with whom we do business or we don't do business, how we are conducting our business, etc. There will also be guidelines for organization development, for example, matrix management rules, which decision overrules which other decision. Then there will be rules about compliance with various functional requirements, for example, how to adhere to IT regulation or budget regulation or labor legislation, etc. Besides designing coordinating governance frameworks and mechanisms, entity system governance also involves establishing planning forums. If you're looking at an organizational matrix, then governance occurs in planning forums. The planning forums are designed according to the matrix structure. In other words, there's a planning forum for each activity system within the matrix, each line within the matrix, and also each sub-activity system and sub-activity systems if we're dealing with large systems. These planning forums can be function-specific or cross-functional. They are function-specific in the case of business and organization support functions, and they are cross-functional in the case of business activity systems. There's also a planning forum that coordinates all activity systems, that is the top management board, and this board represents the level of the entity system. Each planning forum governs its own activity or sub-activity system within the cascaded aims and regulatory requirements. Likewise, each individual member of a planning forum governs his or her sub-activity system or function within that forum, also within the cascaded aims and regulatory requirements. Most staff members are part of more than one planning forum. Typically, each staff member has a specific function. That could be business support or an organization support function. And they are also serving on a business activity system and thereby serve on a cross-functional forum. The design of entity system governance, as we discussed, involves the design of coordinating governance frameworks and mechanisms. It also involves designing and establishing planning forums, and we need to establish systemic planning. In other words, the planning forums must plan in a systemic manner. To do so, they need to understand the changing planning paradigm. The planning paradigm has changed significantly over the last couple of decades. During the industrial age, we used to plan for others in a top-down manner. It was typically top management planned, and then the lower levels in management and their staff had to implement. Now it is planning with the stakeholders, internal and external, and the planning is much more circular. That means top-down cascading of information, which is interpreted at lower levels, and also information coming from the lower levels up to top management level and informs planning there as well. Planning used to emphasize producing a plan. There were these massive tomes of plans produced that landed then in the drawer until the next annual planning came along. Now, planning is much more about producing a short plan and, even more importantly, change the mindsets. And this occurs in a regular ongoing planning routine. The planner used to be the expert. Now planners are facilitators. Every member of a planning forum has unique information to contribute, and the strategic planner has become a facilitator of these unique contributions. Planning used to be about predicting the future so that we could adapt to it. Now we are much more aware that we need to explore alternative futures, that we have to have an ideal future, and that we can co-create a more ideal future. Planning used to be separate from implementation. Top management planned, the staff implemented. Now planning is linked to implementation in an ongoing performance management cycle. It is also useful to understand the purpose of systemic planning. The purpose of planning is that it creates a memory of the future. By that we mean that once we have planned something in detail, we can actually do it. Because we have thought through it, it can be done. So planning changes the conceptual reality, and because conceptual reality informs physical reality, planning creates self-fulfilling prophecies. Anything we plan, we are likely to manifest. Anything we are not planning, we are not likely to manifest. Also, planning changes individual mindsets, and if done collectively in the planning forums in a self-referring manner, we are also changing organization culture in the course of planning. In fact, it is one of the most powerful tools to change organizational culture. As such, planning is a tool as well as a process involved in managing change. To establish systemic planning in an organization, we need to design strategic and operational planning procedures. All planning forums throughout the organization at all levels need to design their strategic and operational planning routine. This involves the design of fixed agendas for its operational and strategic meetings, a planning calendar, how often the strategic and operational meetings are to take place, and each planning forum needs to design knowledge repositories for its operational and strategic learning. The operational learning typically is concerned with best business practice, while a strategic learning obviously involves long-term consideration of a strategic nature. To establish systemic planning in an organization also requires that we have guidelines for strategic and operational planning meetings. In strategic meetings, the environment is explored, both the contextual as well as the transactional environment, in broad terms, while in operations meeting, the environment is only important to the specific issue at hand, and then typically one looks at the specific stakeholder expectations or requirements around that issue. In strategic planning meetings, one deals with broad objectives, broad strategies, longer-term aims, while in operations meetings, one looks at short-term goals and very specific goals. Strategic meetings are more development-orientated and deal with problem-solving, while operations meetings are implementation-orientated and tend to be more problem-solving related. In strategic meetings, we emphasize learning from planning as we explore the environment and its impact and reflect against our own system. We learn, and the learning is conceptual, it is about possibilities, it is futures orientated. By comparison, the learning in operational meeting is from doing, and it is related to daily performance. While in strategic meetings, we tend to also explore more the best and worst performance that the system ever had and what the implications would be for the future. Strategic meetings tend to give rise to longer-term innovations. It is also more an innovation of what the business is about, what it should be doing, how it should change itself in broader terms. By comparison, innovations in operations meetings tend to be associated with short-term improvements. It's more an innovation of how we do things, and it is smaller type of innovation. Then strategic meetings are less frequent. They can be monthly to annually, depends how rapidly the industry is changing. Operational meetings are frequent. They could be daily or monthly, depending again what the nature of the business is. The duration of strategic meetings tends to be longer, maybe half a day up to 3 days, while operations meetings can be as little as half an hour and should not last longer than half a day. Agenda points are fixed in both strategic and operational meetings, whereby the strategic planning agenda points are derived from the planning framework, and those in an operations meeting depend on the project plan or the business practice associated with the specific function. Both strategic and operational meetings are learning focused and ought to be conducted in a self-reflective manner. The insights gained in strategic planning meetings should always be deposited in the knowledge repositories to keep the strategic plan up to date, while the insights gained in operations meeting should be added to a knowledge repository if it is related to the best business case and if it is an insight that is not stored there yet. If an operations issue arises in a strategic meeting, it needs to be referred to operational meetings and not dealt with there in a strategic meeting. Likewise, if a strategic issue arises in an operational meeting, it should be parked for the next strategic meeting. To design the governance of an entity system, as we heard, we need to design coordinating governance frameworks and mechanisms. We need to establish planning forums throughout the organization. We need to establish systemic planning, and we need to establish organizational learning. First, let us look at what are the principles involved in organizational learning. There are two types of organizational learning. The one is planning-based and the other is learning from performance. Learning from planning occurs mostly during strategic planning meetings, while learning from doing occurs in operational meetings and can also occur in strategic meetings from reflection on experience. Learning involves self-reflection. We are not talking here necessarily the individual self only, but that the planning forum members reflect against the system and the self of the system that that particular forum represents. Learning occurs at all levels in the organization, that is at the individual level, at the team level, at the planning forum level. However, organizational learning only takes place if the learning is deposited in learning repositories. The learning repositories mirror the organizational structure. In other words, every planning forum has its strategic and its operational knowledge repository. Let us now look at planning-based organizational learning, and we also give some useful questions that help us to establish planning as learning. The planning-based organizational learning occurs during strategic planning meetings. Arie de Geus, who spearheaded scenario development in business, coined the term planning as learning, namely that the purpose of planning is to learn. This learning from planning involves exploring the strategic fit between the system and its environment. In other words, it needs to explore the ethos and overarching aims of the system, its strengths and weaknesses, and how they relate to the threats and opportunities it perceives in an environment, how it can take advantage of opportunities or counter possible threats given its ethos, aims, and strengths and weaknesses, or if it needs to change its ethos and aims. So based on this exploration, the system needs to decide what should the key objectives and the key strategies be. And that learning needs to be deposited in the strategic knowledge repositories, and it will also inform the strategic plan. Some of the useful questions that can be asked in a strategic meeting to explore that strategic fit are the following. What did or did not change in the contextual environment, in the different sub-environments, the different functional environments like economic, political, cultural, ecological, etc.? And what did or did not change in the transactional environment, namely amongst stakeholders like our customers, suppliers, competitors, etc.? What are our assumptions? Why do we think the environment changes like that or does not change like that? What could be the strategic impacts of these changes? Are those possible threats or opportunities or both? And what are assumptions that we say those are opportunities or threats? How can we respond to those opportunities and threats given our strengths and weaknesses? And how can we maximize our strengths and mitigate or transform our weaknesses in the context of that? And also, how do our aims and ethos relate to those changes? Establishing organizational learning involves planning-based learning as well as performance-based organizational learning. And we provide some useful questions that help us set up performance-based learning. The performance-based organizational learning is learning from doing or learning from experience. It involves, on the one hand, the exploration of the strategic performance management cycle in a learning way, and also exploring the best and worst experience of the system and then to deposit the learning in knowledge repositories. Those could be both strategic or operational knowledge repositories. Useful questions that can be asked in the context of the strategic performance management cycle are the following. Did we do what we planned? Yes or no, and why? Did we achieve the planned outcome? Yes or no, and why? Do we need to do things differently as a result of this? Yes or no, and why? And how? And do we need to do different things? Yes or no, and what? In the context of the best and worst experience, we would explore this mostly in a strategic planning meeting and ask the question, what were the worst success or failure we had in that last strategic period since the last strategic meeting? What are the cofactors that gave rise to the success and the failure? And how can we enlarge the success by building on those cofactors and leveraging from it? And how could we transform our failure cofactors? And of course, the learning will be deposited in either the operational or the strategic learning repositories. And they will inform, in the case of the operational knowledge repository, our best business case, our best business practice. And in the case of the strategic knowledge repository, they will inform our strategic plan. It is inevitable that conflict arises if systems interact. However, one can structure the interaction of systems in such a way that conflict is minimized. One tries to do that through the matrix organization, whereby the interfacing of the different functions within the organization has been designed optimally by means of their co-design and by means of creating a win-win based design. However, this needs to be maintained, and whenever new conflict arises, matrix rules need to be applied and adhered to. Matrix rules usually decide which considerations are more important than other considerations within the larger whole. If this conflict cannot be resolved by means of matrix rules, there is one rule which defers the conflict to the decision-making board that is above the two conflicting parties. There can also be hidden conflicts which are power-related, and there are various systemic methodologies that explore power relations. Let us now look at the application of governance in an activity and entity system. We have learned that entity systems consist of outward, inward and self-directed activity systems, and that these interact in a matrix fashion. Each activity system is governed individually by its own activity system governance, as we have learned of activity system governance before. This is illustrated by the thin orange governance bracket of each activity system. The interaction and balancing between those different activity systems is governed by entity system governance. This is illustrated by the bolder orange governance brackets. The entity system governance in an organization consists of ongoing planning and performance management, also ongoing knowledge management, coordinating governance frameworks, coordinating governance procedures, amongst others. If we compare in a nutshell the activity and entity system governance, then activity system governance is concerned with achieving the specific aims of the activity system, while entity system governance is concerned with coordination. The governance of an activity system consists of aims setting and regulation, namely regulating the behavior of the system in such a way that it achieves its aims. The same is true for activity systems as a whole, as well as each of its sub-activity systems, which form a supply or value chain. Obviously, governance needs to be cascaded from the overarching activity system to the sub-activity systems and sub-activity systems if we have those. By comparison, the entity system governance is concerned with the coordination of the different activity systems with each other. On the one hand, this is achieved through passive governance in the sense that the structures of the organization enforce a particular way of interaction between the activity systems. On the other hand, it consists of coordinating governance, like frameworks, performance management systems, etc., which are illustrated by the bold orange arrows. The purpose of entity system governance is coordination and governing in such a way that the whole organization is optimized and not its parts.